So today, I'm going to focus on one of the fragments from the New Yale Papyrus. On page 12, 33 to 34, there's a brief quotation, number 1 on your hand, that just begins, "Triphis, who has suffered much, says the following, apparently the city of Lycopolis, Asute. You hardly want to be headlong into this disease or illness." So my topic for today, first of all, I wanted to explain exactly who Triphis is. She's not the most popular goddess. And also try to approach what sort of disease or suffering she could have gone through. Now, if you'll turn to your page 3 of the handout, I have some maps. The goddess Triphis is the chief goddess in the region of Afnin. So you can see Afnin's pretty much in Middle Egypt, a little north of Abydos. Afnin is better known to classicists, of course, as Panopolis, due to the similarity between Min and the god Pan. And if you look at the little zoomed-in map, her place, Wanina Triphis, is actually on the west bank of the Nile, close to the desert plateau. And we'll be talking a little bit more about that in a second. So if you turn the page again, we have these pictures to page 4. So the name Triphis, the Hellenized form, corresponds to the Egyptian Repit that you see in hieroglyphic texts. Now, Repit, it's a little unusual for the name of a goddess. Traditionally in Egyptian, it just refers to a female statue. So in ancient Egyptian, they distinguished between male statues, which were called Tut, and statues of women or goddesses, which they called Repits. You'll find this, for example, in the Rosetta Stone when they refer to the different Ptolemaic and their queen statues, etc. So it's a kind of unusual epithet. It occasionally occurs throughout Quranic history, but it's not a very big cult of the goddess. In Afnin itself, Min was usually associated with Isis, or a special form of Isis called Operet-Set. Only in the Ptolemaic and Roman periods do we have this special local form, Repit. So, once again, her name is Repit, and in later Egyptian, particularly in Demotic, they often added the definite pronoun to names of gods and goddesses. So, Re becomes Pere, and Repit becomes Ta Repit, and that's the form that we get in Hellenized form. So, Ta Repit goes into Triphis that we have in Greek. Similarly, her main temple in Egyptian would have been Hut Ta Repit, so the temple of Repit, and that goes into Coptic, the name Tripe, so Udrepi, Atripa, with a few variants. In Greek, you only get basically the Greek translation of this. You don't get Atripe in Greek, you get Tripheon, or Tripheon, or variants of that. Literally, it is called the temple or sanctuary of the goddess Triphis. Now, sorry, 1 second. Now, so Triphis, you'll see pictured also on this page. She's a lion-headed goddess who usually has the sun disk on her head. If you're familiar with Egyptian iconography, you might think she looks like the goddess Sekhmet or a few of the other lion-headed goddesses in Egypt. She's characterized by a particular epithet that she gets at her temple, which is Eye of Horus in the west, which only applies to her. Now, this refers to an Egyptian myth of the wandering goddess of the eye of the sun. Basically, the actual physical eye of the sun god, the word for eye in Egyptian is feminine, Irit, so it is actually divinized as a goddess, a separate goddess. She becomes angry at the sun god and heads off to the western desert or into Nubia as a bloodthirsty, lion-headed goddess, eating up people and kind of in an uncontrollable rage. She has to be pacified by the gods Thoth and Onura's Shu, who go out to the desert and kind of cajole her back. So Thoth goes out to the west, and he's the god of eloquence, so he flatters her the best way he can, and he recites hymns for her. Meanwhile, the god Shu, Onura's consort, and who's also the god of war, dances for her and shows off his athletic prowess to try to convince her to come back. And of course, they also give her a lot of beer and wine that helps the pacification. So anyway, there were a lot of goddesses in Egypt tied to this myth, but particularly in Akhmim, Rephi was the main goddess, and this is emphasized by this aspect that she's in the west. In fact, if you turn to page 5, you'll see there's a photograph from inside the temple. You can see that, unlike other places in Egypt, this temple is actually right up against the desert plateau, the western desert plateau. So it's right up against the mountain. It's in the uncultivated region away from the Nile Valley. And this is partially to allude to the fact that she's a wandering lion goddess coming back from the west. You occasionally find this for other goddesses in Egypt who also have this angry lion aspect. So in Middle Egypt, there's also the famous Speos Artemidos for the goddess Pachet. And you have the Hemispeos for the goddess Nephtheh and El-Kab. And perhaps most dramatically, in Sudan, at Jebel Barkal, you have this rock-cut shrine to the goddess Mut, which is really in the heart of where the lion-headed goddess would be. It's kind of a digression. But of course, this is actually, this mountain aspect is actually important for the later Greek and Coptic periods referring to it. There's a small Greek stela that was found in the region from the reign of Augustus, commemorating the death of a small girl who was bit by a scorpion, or stung by a scorpion, rather. And it points out that she was in the temple of Triphis, close to the mountain. So apparently this was really out in the desert, a place you might actually get kind of scorpion stings. And even Shinuda himself, who we'll be talking about later, usually refers to the region as the mountain of Triphis. That's a little bit about the background. Heading back to page 4, the goddess Triphis is usually, like I said, paired with Min of Akhmim, the main god of Panopolis, as well as a child god named Colanthes, who is the chief god in Ptolemais and Mention. So you'll sometimes see them as a triad, depicted in different places. Now, what do we know about her temple? So, she has a small temple. I mentioned it's out in the west. It was partially uncovered by Petrie, working in the early 20th century, and he documented some of the nice reliefs, did some small excavations, and kind of unfortunately he shipped back some of the better reliefs back to European museums, but he basically only documented about 1/10 of what exists of the temple. It's a very large temple, comparable in size to things like Dendera, for example, but Petrie only had a chance to work on a small portion of it. For the last couple of decades, an interdisciplinary team led primarily from the University of Tübingen has been excavating the rest of the temple and working on restoration and documentation, and actually they're still in progress. So they've published a few volumes already, and they have many more they're working on, and they're actually still clearing away areas of the temple to get new inscriptions. Like I said, it's Petrie sent away some of the better reliefs back, and actually most of the temple is only preserved up to kind of the legs of gods and stuff, so it's only a couple of meters high for most of what we have. There are a lot of interesting inscriptions on the bandeaus and the bases and everything, but being a limestone temple, it seems to have been quite popular for people taking things away, as often happens in Egypt. So, if you'll head back, so you can see some views on page 5 and kind of what it looks like and also the scope of it. Now, if we turn back to page 3, there's a kind of chronology of the temple, or a tentative chronology that was put forth in the new Triphis 1 volume, edited by the Tübingen team. I should point out, I forgot to mention this earlier too, in Coptic the site is referred to as Atripe, so Petrie gave it the kind of made-up Hellenistic form Athribis, based on parallelism with another Athribis, which is known from the Delta. There's no source that actually refers to this plant place as Athribis, but all Egyptologists and other scholars still call the place Athribis just from habit, kind of Petrie starting that out. So you'll see the name of the volumes as Athribis here and there, but I'm going to try to call it Atripe from now on. So, based on the current state of knowledge, Rafid al-Sayed put out a tentative chronology of what happens there. And I just point out some of the details, they might not all be clear. So they think they found some fragments of the king Nectanebo II, so right before Alexander the Great. It's not clear that they're actually from the site. Otherwise, the earliest known temple reliefs there date to Ptolemy the IX and Ptolemy the XII. So roughly from 116 to 50 BC. That seems to be the main locus of activity at the temple. Before then, it's not clear that there even was a temple of Repi in this area. Like I said, she's not mentioned in other Quranic sources. She's not mentioned, for example, at Edfu Temple as being there. It seems to be something from the late period. The decoration continues, at least dated decoration, until the reign of Domitian. He's the last Roman emperor whose name occurs on any of the inscriptions found so far. So that kind of gives kind of the main period of decoration activity as far as we have preserved. Now, we have to be careful about drawing conclusions based on that inscriptional evidence regarding how long the temple was still active. Scholars are wont to look at the last phase of decoration and say, okay, after this point, everything died out, or things died out pretty much after that. But temple inscriptions are not administrative documents. The only thing they're evidence for is people had the money and the desire to add more decorations at that time. They don't have to be continually decorated. If you look at, for example, Notre Dame or something, it's still an active cathedral, even though there aren't new giant stone reliefs added to it every few decades. So bearing that in mind, there's a few other kinds of evidence you might find, like private stelae or other dedications. For my own dissertation, I looked at Roman period Thebes. So for example, which has a lot more temples, a lot better documented activity, but still the last temple reliefs date to the reign of Antoninus Pius. So kind of mid-2nd century. Nonetheless, we still have a private stele for the Bucus bowl, so the local divine bowl, kind of like the Apis bowl, as late as the reign of Constantius II. So centuries later, they're still worshiping the bowl, and he was still receiving stately funerals. So activity was still happening there, even though the temples aren't being lavishly decorated each year. So that's something to bear in mind. So for Triphis, we have a few dedications here and there. From the reign of Hadrian, there's a very famous stela that was once in the Berlin Museum and now was lost in World War II, depicting Hadrian worshiping to Minabach Meme, Triphis, and the other local gods. Similarly, if you look on page 4, reliefs from the Temple of Esna, further south in Egypt, one of the last, contains some of the last temple reliefs in Egypt. Caracalla is offering wine to Min and Triphis, so presumably the cult was still active at that point. We have no evidence after that. And then, so that's roughly the beginning of the 3rd century, and then sometime in the 4th century, a Greek letter, Papyrus Fuad 80, can't be more narrowly dated than 4th century apparently, refers to a priestess of Triphis. So there's apparently at least some sort of formal activity still going on in the temple in the 4th century. Now, this brings us to the sources, the quotations I have again on page 1. So the second quote here is an excerpt from the Panopolis Papyri, which are different dispatches related to an imperial visit of Diocletian to the area around Akhmim. So within this, I just have in italics, there's a communication that mentions that someone's in charge of bedding in the palace within the Tripheion. Specifically, that would house Diocletian when he arrived. So we don't know if he actually came or if they ever built this palace, but the letter refers to that. Some scholars have assumed that since there's apparently some sort of imperial residence or temporary imperial residence in the temple, then temple activity must have been wiped out at this point, because who would interrupt temple services to host an emperor? I don't think this argument is necessarily convincing, once again, especially because of the Papyrus Fuad 80 I mentioned, where there's still priestesses active there at this time. But also, for example, Caracalla, when he went to Alexandria, actually stayed within the Serapeum there. So it's not, these would have been nice, stately places to host the emperor during his visit. So this has been used to kind of point to an early demise of the temple for unknown reasons. We also have to wonder if it had already been damaged and was out of use, why they would have hosted the emperor there of all places, why he would have stopped at the defunct Triphis temple rather than going to Akhmim or doing something else. We can talk about the meaning of this a little bit later. So this is one of the other pieces of evidence we have. And then the majority of things relating to the downfall of Triphis come from the writings of Shinuda. Saint Shinuda a very prolific, very prodigious Coptic writer of basically from 4th to 5th centuries. I pointed out here, I just wanted to correct these dates. Shinuda, I pointed here, is active from 385 to 465 CE. That's not his lifespan, that's when he was in charge of the White Monastery Federation. He was actually supposedly born in around 348. The dates are kind of uncertain, but he would have been basically alive through the entire second half of the 4th century. Among many other things he's famous for, all of his writings, foundation of the White Monastery, his canons, his tons of Coptic discourses. He's also often brought up for his conflicts with local pagans in the area. It's one of the only sources we have for Christians actually actively attacking local Egyptian pagans in Coptic writings. I'm sure most people here are aware of Shinuda in general and his personality, and most recently I recommend the book by Ariel Lopez about Shinuda and the uses of poverty. It's a good discussion of kind of his significance and socioeconomic role, but you're probably also aware that he antagonized a local pagan, a local wealthy pagan in Gesios, which is intriguing for this conference because Gesios is mentioned, of course, several times in Palladas' poetry. It doesn't have to be the same Gesios, there are multiple people with that name, but it's just something to bear in mind. So multiple times Shinuda publicly harangues Gesios for still being a pagan, or being a crypto-pagan, and in the text De Judicio, so the first quote I have, he refers to actually finding Gesios within the temple of Atripe, worshiping Satan, and kind of carrying out traditional Egyptian pagan rituals for him there. So this is interesting. It's an accusation against Gesios. Whether he did it or not is unclear. What is interesting for us is that he refers then, meaning that Gesios was still doing things in Atripe, even though it already burnt down that place of idols, along with all of the things that were within it. So you can turn a skeptical eye to Shinuda's writings in general, but this is referred to as just background information to his main address. It's kind of things that everyone already knows about. Yes, remember that time we went and burned down that temple. Similarly then, in the fourth quotation from a text Stephen Emmel referred to as Let Our Eyes, he's similarly accusing Gesios of being a crypto-pagan and refers to a time when Shinuda rounded up various monks and went into his house, where they discovered various cult statues, little shrines, cultic implements that proved that he was a pagan. And then he even points out that if it had not been me that smashed such things in the temple that we burnt down along with all of the things there, then we would not have recognized basically that Gesios had authentic pagan elements in his house. So once again, this is background information that Shinuda had been inside, presumably an active temple that actually had traditional Egyptian cult equipment, burnt it down, and then later used this, was informed by this when he was able to attack Gesios. Finally, another fragmentary quotation, number 5, once again refers that they burnt down the temple of the idol worshippers in Atripe. So bringing this all together, what can we conclude from this? Now, let's go back to the handout to another page. Now, bringing to the Egyptological perspective, we look to, so page 6, there's a photograph of the White Monastery Church that Shinuda presumably founded and actually helped build and organize. This is an amazing edifice. It's very large. It's actually bigger than a lot of Egyptian temples. But if you turn the page, on page 7, it's also notable for including a large amount of Pharaonic, Ptolemaic, and Roman spolia, so different architectural elements, shrines, and other objects. So you'll see the first example I have here, some of the door frames. One, there's some sort of column capitals for more Hellenistic monuments. So this one on the top, if you look on the left, is actually an Egyptian offering scene. with hieroglyphic inscriptions turned upside down to help support a door. But then there's other elements further down. So this is a large monolithic naos, an altar to one side, and then even a little statue base with a Greek inscription that probably came from Ptolemaios or something that's just inside the church. So there's various pharaonic elements were rebuilt into the actual walls, and then there's also just random antiquities that are kind of around the church. It's a little bit confusing. So Petrie, when he visited, initially just assumed that all of those elements came from Triphis. So of course, Triphis was destroyed, and like Shinuda said, he actually was in charge of that, and then he took the stones and used it to build the White Monastery. This has been questioned over the years for different reasons. One of them has to do with this monolithic naos that you see here in the bottom left corner. So this is it's not built into the walls, but it's housed within the White Monastery. And it's dedicated to a god named Horus Inishenut, whose name means Horus who consumes human flesh, who was supposed to be from the region. And we know from other sources that there was a god like that in the region. So Serge Soneron assumed that the site of the White Monastery was originally a temple to this flesh-consuming god, and that they used all of those blocks for it. And this has been followed by a lot of scholars, most recently Raphael Syed. Unfortunately, this is the only object that seems to actually refer to them. Now, in 2007, I started working, I was still a graduate student at Yale, I started working with the White Monastery documentation project, headed by Professor Bentley Layton at the time, and Stephen Davis and other scholars that were working on different aspects of the White Monastery Church, the area, the Red Monastery, etc. And I wanted to get a clear picture of all of the different pharaonic and later spolia to try to see where it comes from, how it's used, etc. And try to catalog it all. And like I said, I didn't find anything that pointed to as Horus Inishenut, but rather I found a bunch of different things. So on the one hand, turn the page again, page 8, there are a large number of these very finely carved granite blocks, very large granite blocks, primarily used for ceiling blocks, staircases, and like you saw on the previous page, sometimes for supporting lintels, plinths, and things like that. These are made from very nice granite, probably from Elephantine. And these are, I think, what most tourists and Egyptologists visiting have noted over the years because they're very prominent. I should point out as well that these all would have been covered over with plaster. Some of this still remains. They would have been plastered over and then painted. So they wouldn't have actually been visible during Shinuda's time. A large number of these, however, date to the 26th dynasty, so roughly 570 to 526 BCE. And most of them mention the name of the pharaoh Amasis. Now, there's no evidence that Amasis built anything about Triphis. And in fact, none of these granite blocks say anything about the god of Repit, about the god of Min, or anything local to this area. Instead, a large number of them mention the god Osiris of Abydos, with his special epithet Chentiamentia. And in fact, one of the blocks contains a small ownership inscription, so you'll see this in the middle of page 8 on the left, that mentions the king Amasis, but also that it includes Osiris, lord of, and Abydos is probably to be restored. I can restore that because nearly identical inscriptions were found by Petrie and then Barry Kemp, actually in Abydos at the site of Amasis' Osiris temple. So in Abydos, Amasis built a large temple of his own that only the ground levels subsist. So at some point, that temple was dismantled, and the blocks eventually made their way up to Triphis. It's possible that that temple was destroyed as early as Cambyses, so immediately after the reign of Amasis, when the Persians invaded and Cambyses attacked a lot of Amasis' monuments throughout Egypt. It's really not clear how they got to the White Monastery. But they're distributed throughout the church, and primarily in, like I said, in very architecturally important places. So that's one subset of it. But turning to page 9, in the north staircase of the church, so actually in the church proper, not in the large nave or the narthex, there's a number of these limestone blocks with Greco-Roman inscriptions. You can tell by the epigraphy and the quality of the relief kind of thing. You find blocks like this in most Ptolemaic temples, similar decoration, a lot of stars, a lot of winged figures, some dedication inscriptions. Most of them are too damaged to really say much about them, but one of them I documented. You'll see on the top right, you can see an excerpt of the hieroglyphic inscription. Says specifically that the king erected or set up a sky outfitted with stars. So this is referring to building the ceiling of the temple that has all the stars on it. Above the earth for his mother, the eye of Horus, repeat in the west. So this is her characteristic epithet we discussed earlier, and this is very clearly the goddess Triphis. So this inscription alone suffices to show that this ceiling block must have come from a part of the temple of Atripe, dedicated to the goddess Triphis. I just point out that not many ceiling blocks have been found in situ at the temple so far. It's mainly just the bottom registers of things. But one of the ones that has been published contains the same formulation at the beginning with this identical spelling of the word Sa'aha, the first word. So you see this on the bottom here. It's not identical, but it's very similar. And once again, Atripe is also built primarily from limestone blocks, a very similar kind of epigraphy like we have from the ceiling blocks. So this shows that already in Shinuda's time, presumably when this was all built, they were not only using just random granite blocks from the general area of Middle Egypt they got their hands on, but they were also profiting from ceiling blocks from the temple of Atripe. Now this doesn't mean that Shinuda destroyed the entire temple of Atripe. He doesn't say that. He says he set a fire there, burned things that were in there. But it does show that they at least took advantage of being able to remove some of the ceiling blocks and use them at that very early stage. Now, I'm going to get into some of the other things. I just wanted to wrap up how this relates again, possibly to the Palladas fragment or not. I mean, I hope it would. That's why I've been talking about this so long. But basically, looking back at that chronology, we have a very short history of this temple of Atripe. It's not like something like Karnak that goes back to the 2nd millennium BC and goes all the way to the 4th, 5th century. It's basically 100 BC to around 300 CE. We know that there's some sort of activity going on there, and then sometime around 400 CE, Shinuda builds a white monastery, presumably taking blocks from there. Possibly earlier than that, when he's going back and forth with Gesius, he presumably set fire to the temple itself. Note, for example, that Shinuda never was able to muster enough kind of local energy to actually destroy the temple in Akhmim at Panopolis. He was only able to do this small kind of isolated temple out in the desert near his community. But basically, we have a short span, a pretty nice temple with no other records of any kind of hardships until we get to Shinuda, at the end of latter part of the 4th century, when this is, as I mentioned earlier, besides from the Seraphim and Alexandria, attested example of Christians actually taking credit for destroying the Egyptian temple. Is it possible to link this to Palladas' mentions, namely that Triphis has suffered much, and she's warning another city not to go into this disease? Is this referring to some sort of Christian extremism, attacking other temples, getting to a fight between pagans and Christians? Or is it, as Kevin Wilkinson suggested, was there some sort of local rebellion, not attested, unfortunately, in the documentary source, around the time of Diocletian? Was there some sort of, for example, was Atripe somehow involved in the local rebellions that took place right around 300 when Valerius had to come in and put down local rebellions in Coptos and Borasus? It's not mentioned, but it's theoretically possible. How exactly this evidence fits in, when exactly Shinuda was doing this sort of activity, and also when exactly Palladas was active, and when the Yale Papyrus specifically dates to, unfortunately, is still a very complicated question. I regret I'm not able to hear all of the other talks and the most recent discussions about this here. But leaving it with this question here, I once again invite you to email me if you have any questions about the White Monastery Imperial or Shinuda in general. And hopefully we can have some discussion about how this might relate to the other Palladas controversies at this conference. Thank you very much.